Hi guys, welcome back to TV Spoilers. Today I'm going to reveal to you the drama unfolding of Yuling as Chancellor.
Y&R the Restless Spoilers. Lauren stepped into Billy's chancellor office carrying the kind of news that changes the temperature of a room. It wasn't just her expression, but the way her presence seemed heavier than usual, as if she'd been holding her breath for miles before finally arriving here. Billy had been forcing himself into work mode, pretending the paperwork and the company chatter could drown out the unease that had been following him lately. But one look at Lauren told him this wasn't about business. She didn't soften it, because she knew Billy would instinctively argue against anything that sounded like rumor or exaggeration. Instead, she gave him the truth plainly. Jill's health was declining, and it was getting worse faster than anyone had wanted to admit. The careful optimism people wrap around a situation like this, those reassuring phrases, those vague timelines, was starting to crack. Lauren explained that Jill had begun putting her final affairs in order, not out of melodrama, but out of the same fierce practicality that had always defined her. And then came the detail that hit Billy hardest, the detail that made his mind go still for a moment as if it didn't know how to process what it meant. Jill had started updating her will. Not talking about it, not considering it. Doing it, taking steps, making decisions that belonged to a future Billy had never allowed himself to picture. In that instant, Billy wasn't the man sitting at the center of Chancellor's chaos, trying to steady a company that always seemed one crisis away from collapse. He wasn't even the man who had trained himself to hide pain behind sarcasm and bravado. He was simply a son staring at the possibility of losing his mother. And the fear rose so quickly it felt physical, tightening his chest, blurring the edges of the room, making everything sound distant. The shock wasn't only that Jill was preparing for the worst, but that she had looked the worst possibility in the face and moved forward anyway. Billy tried to respond like an adult, tried to ask the right questions, tried to hold himself upright, but grief doesn't wait for permission from logic. It stormed up inside him, fierce and silent at the same time, the kind of terror that doesn't scream but destroys stability from the inside out. He hated feeling powerless. He hated the idea that time could decide something this final without giving him a vote. Yet under that fear, another thought crept in, one Billy didn't want to acknowledge, because it sounded ugly even inside his own head. What did this mean for Chancellor, for his place in it? For the legacy Jill had built with her own hands and protected with her own ruthless will? Billy found himself caught between two instincts that didn't belong together: love and survival. He didn't want to be the man calculating outcomes while his mother was suffering, and he hated himself for the questions that began to form anyway. Was his position secure? Would Jill's will change the balance of power? Had she made provisions that could reshape everything he'd been fighting to hold on to? The guilt hit him immediately, sharp and humiliating, because he didn't want anyone, especially Jill, to think he cared about titles more than her life. But he also knew how Genoa City worked, and that knowledge wasn't cynicism, it was experience. He had seen people circle vulnerable moments like predators. He had watched grief become opportunity, watched weakness become an invitation. If Jill truly was preparing for something unthinkable, Chancellor would become a battlefield the second the right people sensed blood in the water. Billy's worrying wasn't only ambition. It was the fear that Jill's entire legacy could be distorted, stolen, or weaponized the moment she wasn't there to guard it. The pressure of that possibility landed on him like stone. And suddenly he was trying to carry two impossible weights at the same time: his mother's mortality and the company's survival. Lauren could see the war happening behind Billy's eyes. She saw the shift from stunned silence to guarded calculation, from raw emotion to that familiar, defensive edge Billy always wore when he felt cornered. She didn't judge him, because she understood him. Billy was the kind of man who loved fiercely but feared being swallowed by loss. So he tried to control whatever he could: facts, narratives. outcomes, especially when his heart was screaming that control was an illusion. And what terrified him most wasn't only the thought of losing Jill, but the realization of what her absence would mean. Jill wasn't just his mother, she was his anchor, his fiercest critic, his harshest protector, the force that could still pull him back from the worst version of himself. He could argue with her, disappoint her, rebel against her, and still somewhere deep down trust that her presence made the world steadier. The moment Billy admitted that to himself, the fear sharpened into something more painful than panic. It became grief in advance. He realized how much he had depended on Jill without ever wanting to confess it, and the thought made him grip the edge of his desk as if the furniture itself was the only thing keeping him upright. And then, instead of trying to regain control through questions and strategy, Billy made the only decision that felt real. He had to see Jill immediately, not tomorrow, not after a meeting. Not once he finished pretending work mattered more than what was happening now. The decision was love and fear tangled together, an urgent need to look at her with his own eyes and reassure himself she was still fighting. And also a refusal to let life move forward without him there to witness it. He pushed back from his chair too quickly, the scrape of it against the floor loud in the sudden silence, like a warning shot in the middle of a room that had just become sacred. Lauren didn't stop him. She only watched, worried, because she knew Billy was running toward a truth that might change everything. Billy walked out of Chancellor with a determination so tight it almost looked like anger. But as the door shut behind him, a colder thought cut through the heat of his urgency. If Jill had already begun updating her will, then she had already made a final choice about what comes next, and Billy might be the last person to learn what she decided, just as others begin to move. Lauren arrived at Billy's office with the kind of urgency that doesn't need an announcement, because it announces itself in the face tight around the eyes, tense at the mouth, controlled only by sheer will. Chancellor had always been noisy in a silent way, full of shifting power and unspoken threats. But the moment she stepped inside, the room felt stripped of that familiar corporate electricity and replaced by something colder, more intimate, and far more frightening. Billy could read people well, and he read Lauren instantly. This wasn't an update, it was a warning. The air between them carried the weight of London, of doctors' voices on the other end of a line, of hospital corridors and decisions that cannot be postponed. Lauren didn't waste time easing him into it, because there are truths that become cruel when you dress them up. She told him Jill's condition had turned critical, worse than anyone expected, worse than the hopeful version they'd all been clinging to. The doctors in London were not optimistic about a full recovery, and that phrase alone sounded like a door half closing, the softest language possible for something that could still destroy a family. Then Lauren went further, and the ground shifted under Billy's feet. Jill might need an emergency procedure, high risk, urgent, and necessary to keep her alive, not a comfortable treatment plan. Not a slow road of rehabilitation, a sharp turn into danger, where even the best outcome would be uncertain and the worst outcome would be permanent. Billy's reaction wasn't dramatic, because shock doesn't always look like an outburst. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like the mind freezes to buy itself time. His body stayed upright, but his thoughts scattered. For a few seconds, he was caught between disbelief and the desperate instinct to negotiate with reality, as if he could argue these words back into a safer shape. Jill had always been a storm in human form, unyielding, relentless, larger than any room she entered, and the idea of her lying in a hospital bed, reduced to charts and percentages, felt impossible. But Lauren's expression didn't allow him the comfort of denial. The risk wasn't hypothetical, the urgency wasn't symbolic. This was happening now, on a different continent, and he wasn't there. Billy's hands moved without his permission, gripping the edge of his desk as if the wood could stabilize him. He tried to focus on the details, because details are easier than feelings, but every detail Lauren offered made the truth heavier. The doctors were cautious, guarded, already preparing the language of limitation. They weren't promising recovery, they were discussing survival. And Billy hated himself for the way his mind immediately raced toward the kind of losses he could measure, because the loss he feared most couldn't be measured at all. As the news sank in, something else rose in: uncomfortable, unavoidable reckoning. Billy had been chasing Chancellor with the intensity of someone who believed the next victory would finally quiet the chaos inside him. He told himself it was about proving he belonged, about protecting what Jill built, about claiming a legacy that always seemed just out of reach. But Lauren's words made the office around him feel absurd, like a stage set compared to the reality of a mother possibly fighting for her life. The company suddenly looked like what it truly was: important, yes, but replaceable in the face of a loss that would hollow him out. And that realization didn't arrive gently. It arrived like shame. Billy had spent so much of his adult life trying to outrun his own weaknesses, trying to win something that would finally make him feel solid. And now he was being reminded that the person who had shaped him most, who had bruised him and protected him, challenged him and steadied him, might be slipping away while he sat here surrounded by polished furniture and corporate ambition. He found himself remembering Jill in fragments, not in neat, sentimental scenes, but in sharp emotional flashes, the way her voice could cut through his excuses, the way she could look at him like she already knew what he was going to do wrong before he did it, the way she could be ruthless with the world but strangely, fiercely invested in him even when he didn't deserve it. Jill had never been easy, but she had always been there, and the terrifying part of this moment was realizing how much of Billy's identity was still tethered to her presence, to her ability to loom over his choices like a force of nature. The pressure inside Billy split into two competing instincts, one soft and panicked, one hard and defensive. The soft part of him wanted to collapse into the simplest truth: he needed his mother, and he was not ready to lose her. The hard part of him began scanning the horizon for what this would mean next, because that's what living in Genoa City teaches you to do. Crisis is never only crisis here. It becomes leverage. It becomes a trigger. It becomes an opportunity for someone else's agenda. Billy didn't want to think that way when Jill was in danger, but he couldn't stop it. If Jill's condition was critical, then the world would adjust around that fact, and Chancellor, his position, his fragile claim to stability, would be pulled into the orbit of that adjustment. He hated himself for even letting the thought exist, but it wasn't greed that created it. It was fear. Fear of being left exposed. Fear that without Jill, the ground beneath him would shift in ways he could not control. And worst of all, fear that he would later look back on this moment and realize he wasted time on the wrong battles, when the only battle that mattered was the one happening in a hospital room far away. Lauren watched him with a quiet steadiness, as if she understood that Billy was fighting not just grief but guilt, not just terror but the reflex to armor himself with strategy. She didn't need to tell him what he already knew. Jill's situation demanded his presence, not his management skills. Billy felt the conflict grinding inside him like a gear stripped of oil. The part of him that had been trying to hold Chancellor together wanted to insist he could do both, that he could stay in control, that he could keep the machine running while also being a son. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. When a parent becomes fragile, the child inside you wakes up, no matter how old you are, and suddenly your accomplishments feel like paper shields. Billy's voice didn't need to break for the moment to be devastating. It was devastating because he could feel the moment rearranging his priorities without asking permission. He began to measure his recent choices against the possibility of regret, and the scale tipped quickly. Chancellor could wait. Rivalries could wait. Proving himself could wait. None of it would matter if Jill's story ended while he was still arguing with the world about his own worth. By the time Billy finally moved, it wasn't with the dramatic flourish of a hero, but with the quiet decisiveness of someone who has run out of excuses. The office around him felt smaller, almost irrelevant. He understood, with a clarity that made his throat tighten, that family isn't something you schedule around ambition. Family is the thing that remains when ambition fails to comfort you. He decided he would go to Jill. He would be there even if he had to drop every responsibility that had been feeding his ego and numbing his fear. He would sacrifice whatever he had to sacrifice, because this wasn't about being the man in charge anymore. It was about being the son who shows up before it's too late. And as I imagine that choice, I can't help feeling the ache beneath it. The kind of ache stories like this always stir in me, because they remind me how easily we let ourselves believe we have endless time. We convince ourselves there will be another call, another visit, another chance to say what matters after we finish whatever we think is urgent. Then life proves how fragile that illusion is. Billy's decision to put Jill first feels like the only honest response to a world that keeps trying to distract him with power and titles, and it leaves me with that uncomfortable human thought I never quite shake. When the moment comes, will any of us recognize what truly mattered soon enough to choose it without hesitation? On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.